I learned in my life that many of the things that surprised me didn't happen in my lifetime, but they happened many times before. And there were three big things that are taking place, big forces that are happening in our lifetimes that happened many times before. And they are the creation of an enormous amount of debt and the printing of money to service those debts. And so the economic consequences, inflation and what it means for growth and tight money and all of that. The second is the levels of internal conflict are the highest since the 1930 to 45 period and other times before. Lots of internal conflict, the emergence of populism of the left and the right, the largest wealth gaps since the 1930 to 45 period. And so a lot of internal conflict fighting, populism on the left, populism on the right, that's threatening to our system. And number three is the external conflict, which some people call, the great powers conflict, the rising of a great power to challenge an existing great power and to challenge the world order. The way it works is you usually have a big disagreement, you have a fight, you have a war. The winners of the war create the new system, the new order. And that happened in 1945. And then they're a dominant power and they sort of set the rules. And then there's the emergence of the other power and that conflict. And so those three things, each one of them, the last time they happened in this magnitudes was 1930 to 45. And when they come together like that, it's sort of a perfect storm. And so I needed to study what happened before. And because these rises and declines take place on average about 75 years, give or take about 50, these ups and downs, I needed to go back about 500 years and watch them. And I watched the same thing happen over and over again for the same reasons. And I also paid attention to two other big influences. So let's call it the fourth influence is the impact of nature. The droughts, floods, and pandemics have actually killed more people than wars and toppled more governments and systems. So they are a big influence. So something like climate change and what we're seeing is a disruptive influence. It's a costly disruptive influence. And then number five is the good one over long periods of time, which is the inventiveness and doing things better, creating inventions, particularly technologies, which has meant that life expectancies have increased, per capita income has increased, and so on. And so when we look at that, we see those five big forces are driving everything. And so that's that dynamic. Now we could talk about each one of them, and when we do, but we also have to remember that they affect each other in a mutually reinforcing way.
Ray, when you kind of look at the body of work that you put together in the Changing World Order, publishing it in 2021, and here we are in the second quarter of 2023, are you more worried now than when you put out the book?
It's tracking the typical cycle, and that's why I really want to draw attention to it. In order to draw attention to it, there's the book, but there's also a free video on YouTube called The Changing World Order, and describes it, but it lays out the cause-effect relationship. So it's like a disease, and there are these stages, cycles, and we're in stage 5. So it continues to track that, and we should get specific about that. What I mean, for example, if you want me to delve into them,
Oh, yes, please.
Okay. In these cycles, there are short-term cycles that build up to create a long-term cycle. So, for example, we're used to what's commonly called the business cycle or the short-term debt cycle, in which there's a recession when economic weakness is economic weakness and low inflation, and then the central bank provides credit, and that stimulates activity, and then you have the pickup and the good time in the economy, but then it raises inflation and tightness and so on, and then they create tight money, and then you go through the contraction again and so on. So since 1945, there have been 12 and a half of those cycles. On average, they're about 7 years long, give or take about 3 years. So if you say, okay, where are we in that cycle? We're in the business cycle. We're about halfway through. We're in the part of the cycle where the tightening of monetary policy to fight inflation begins to cause the cracks. And that's where we are. Okay, now those add up to a big cycle because debt rises relative to incomes through that because everybody wants the higher up. And so they just keep doing that. And so we have a lot of debt assets and debt liabilities. We think of there's a debt that you owe, but one man's debt is another man's assets. And so you have to keep interest rates high enough that it compensates for inflation for holding it. Because if you don't, nobody's going to then want to lend and have a problem. But you have to have interest rates not so high that they crack the economy. And so when you have debt, a lot of debt assets and a lot of debt liabilities, having that balancing act is not easy. And so because we had the imbalance, the central banks of the world had to come in there and be buyers. They had to print money and buy that debt to make a balance at an acceptable interest rate. So we have that problem. That produced inflation, and we have the financial problem. Now that's connected also to what's happening in the world order, because the United States and China, most importantly, are approaching a war, the greater risk of a war, and also Russia is in that there have been, supply chains have been broken, and supply lines and so on, and that has worsened this set of circumstances for reasons having to do with geopolitical and so on. So we are in that spot. Now, let me be more specific. What happened in this period is that a lot of government debt was sold, and it was sold to a lot of buyers. So when you look at Silicon Valley Bank situation, it's important to understand that that's just one example of an enormous number of cases in which short-term borrowing was used to finance the purchase of a lot of government bonds and beyond bonds beyond that, mortgage payments, and also corporate bonds and so on, because money was given away free. I mean, think about it this way. The government interest rate was 0.7%. Low-grade credits were about 3.5% interest rate, but they also had interest-only loans. So it meant you really didn't have to pay hardly anything to get money. So we have all of that debt, and now the government bonds have gone down, and it's funded by short-term debt, which the cost of money has gone up. Now, that's not just banks. That's not just the United States. That's a world phenomenon. It existed in Europe because the central banks there in Europe provided money like that. Imagine they created negative interest rates for money. So how does somebody make money holding a bond that has a negative interest rate? The way you do it is you have a more negative short-term interest rate that you borrow to fund it. And so that's what went on, and that's what we have. So if you look at, let's say, if you marked to market the bonds at existing rates, you have a lot of terribly financially hurt, negative net worth entities around the world. The world is leverage long. So we have that dynamic going on at the same time as we have the other things that I was referring to. So that's the financial dynamic.